Safer at Home series of lectures. I'm very glad to have you join us again tonight on a sultry night in southeastern Massachusetts. The heat and humidity has remained with us. Before we get started tonight, I want to mention a couple of things. Want to thank our sponsors for this program, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Martha's Vineyard Savings. And as you know, all books that are part of our Safer at Home series are made available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope you participate and become a patron for them. We want to remind you that this is being recorded. And if you've got any questions at the end of the talk, down below is the chat feature. So type your questions in on the chat feature. So use that. And again, we mentioned this last week that if you got any ideas for programs, feel free to mention them to me. Send me an email. You can send it in a chat. All these programs are free through August, but as we know, these virtual talks are going to remain with us for a while. We want to make sure that you're safer at home. We want to make sure that people like Brenda are safe at home. So we want to continue doing this for the foreseeable future. So thanks for participating in this. Now, our speaker tonight, actually, we tried doing this last year, and life got in the way. And then she was obviously going to come to Falmouth, and life got in the way. So Brenda Wineapple is an award-winning author. She's written several books. She's also born and raised in Massachusetts. So this is not her. This might be her first virtual trek to the Cape, but it's not her first time being in Massachusetts. So would you? And just so you know. Like I said, we've been planning this for a while. I am not coming at this. There was no agenda by me, but by having a talk 2 weeks ago saying how to get rid of a president, and one today with the Impeachers. This is strictly coincidental. So without further ado, would you welcome our guest tonight, Brenda Wineapple?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Is everything? Are all of the systems working okay? Okay, good. I'm never sure about these things, and I'm still rather new at it, as I guess we all are. But as Mark was saying, it's something we're going to have to get used to, I'm afraid, for the foreseeable future. And I'm sorry that, as Mark said, life got in the way last summer so that I couldn't meet you in person, but this will do. Yes, I always enjoy coming back to Massachusetts, even in the heat of summer. And so I'm a little bit disappointed, but obviously glad to be here. And I don't know about your recent conversation about getting rid of presidents, but there was an effort both recently and quite a long time ago to get rid of a president. And in fact, my husband just said to me today that that he bets, I don't know if I agree with him, but he bets that a number of Republicans who voted not to convict the current president regret their vote. So who's to say? I think in 1868 that wasn't the case, but it's kind of interesting. One of the first questions I always get about the Impeachers, which, as you may know, came out last year, this past spring, excuse me. One of the questions that I always get is, when did you start writing this? You know, sort of a kind of, not a hostile question, but it's almost as if I was capitalizing on current events in some kind of way. And as I never hesitated to point out, I actually began the book in around 2013, which is quite a while ago. These books do take a long time. And it was deep into the Obama's presidency. And there was no way that anyone could have foreseen the future. And insofar as anyone thinks that I did, believe me, if I could foresee the future, I would have changed it. But I don't have that kind of power. But impeachment, at the time I began this particular book, was on absolutely no one's mind. Presidential impeachment may have been floated here and there about George Bush, about the potential Hillary Clinton as a president, but it never really took any hold, and people mistakenly even thought that Nixon was impeached, which he in fact wasn't. It's a very unusual thing to happen in American history, and that's exactly why I began the book, because it occurred to me, came out of the book I had written before that, which is called Ecstatic Nation, and it's about 19th century cultural and political history. And when I was working on that book, it occurred to me, and it was rather perplexed, that such an important event in American history, the first ever presidential impeachment, was something I knew very little about, almost nothing about. In fact, I would ask around, and people didn't know much more than I did, and I thought, isn't that strange? I'm a relatively literate person. I know a lot about the 19th century, I know a fair amount of American history. How is it that I don't know anything about this major event? And especially, it seemed to me, how is that possible when in fact that event, the first ever impeachment of a president, actually occurred right after the Civil War? I mean, not directly after, but close enough, 3 years. We can all imagine just 3 years, they go very quickly. Just 3 years after the first ever Civil War, the only war, and what's more, is the first ever presidential assassination. It was a rather remarkable thing that in this particular period of history, a presidential impeachment took place. So I began the book, and I began thinking about this book, and I'll be very eager to hear your questions. But I began the book, and I began thinking about the two ways. One is I wanted to know what happened, because that seemed very interesting. But also I wanted to know why most of us, many of us, didn't know anything about it. And in fact, fairly recently, when current events caught up with me, or I got asked out impeachment because it was, newsworthy. One of the things that seemed so fascinating is that even people who were talking about impeachment often skipped over the Johnson impeachment as if it didn't happen. And in fact, just the year before my book came out, just before it came out, in the New York Times, on a front page essay, book review, in the book review, Andrew Sullivan wrote a cover piece, and he said that the grounds for impeaching Andrew Johnson were preposterous. I happened by that time to have done my work and completely disagreed. But again, I wanted to know what had happened, and that's where, as I said, I got started. Some people who knew and still know about the Andrew Johnson, not LBJ, the Andrew Johnson impeachment, the main thing that they heard about it was something that they had read or remembered reading from a very popular book in the 1950s, 1957. John F. Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage. In Profiles in Courage, he had a chapter on a man named Edmund Ross. He's a senator from Kansas. And he basically said that Ross had been courageous because he voted against his party, almost as if he were Mitt Romney recently. He voted against his party but in this case, acquit Andrew Johnson. So he swam against the tide. And it was only, by the way, by one vote that Andrew Johnson was acquitted. What JFK or Ted Sorensen, who wrote the book, didn't say was that it's likely that Ross was bribed. And if he wasn't, if money actually didn't change hands, then it's also true that he asked Andrew Johnson after the vote, in exchange for the vote, for all kinds of perks and jobs for friends and relatives. But the book basically said that the actual cause, and this is Kennedy or Sorensen writing, the actual cause for which the president was impeached was not fundamental to the nation, not fundamental to the nation. I happen to disagree, but that was the standard wisdom about the Andrew Johnson impeachment. It was not fundamental to the nation, that it was a group of fanatics called the radical Republicans. Republicans and Democrats aren't the same party as they are today. They were kind of switched. That basically what they wanted was political power. They were diabolical. They were hell-bent on revenge against the South. They were bent on destroying and humiliating the South. And it's interesting, this kind of point of view, by the way, that became dominant in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, is the same point of view. It's very relevant. It's just kind of striking to me how relevant it is. It's the very same point of view that got all of those Confederate statues built, particularly at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. You know, so history is very interesting in that particular way, because what that did was basically give the South a reason to be proud and say that, in a way, the Civil War really shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't have ended the way it did. So it seems to me that actually, and what's so pertinent today, is that there was an opportunity that impeachment brought up for the nation, and really an opportunity that spoke right after the war, as I said, about the direction that the country would take. Because I have to ask you to think about what was going on in 1865. Your president, beloved even by many in the South, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated. The war was just over. And you had 11 states of the so-called and former Confederacy wanting to come back into the Union, into the House and Senate. So the question would be, what were the terms for reentry? Should they be welcomed back into the House and Senate, all forgiven, like nothing had happened, and just say it was a big mistake, the 750,000 dead, you know, we just sort of forget about that. Congress, at any time, gets to decide the qualifications of its own members. And so when Johnson took office after Lincoln's assassination, many men in Congress, they were all men before suffrage 1920, they came to Johnson and they said, we should have a special session to decide what to do about these former 11 states. And Johnson refused to do that. In fact, what he began to do was actually reestablish the South as it was, just without slavery. In other words, he started putting former Confederates into the government by executive proclamation. He started pardoning Confederates left and right. And he basically said, to his way of thinking, the South had never seceded because it was against the Constitution. And one of the impeachers later, a very unusual man named Thaddeus Stevens, said that's like saying a murder didn't happen because murder's against the law. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, really, in that particular way. So Johnson was giving them very lenient terms. And when you give that lenient terms, what you're forgetting about, and this is so key to what happened, what you're forgetting about are the 4 million Black men and women recently freed, but who had been deprived during their lifetime, even of the ability to read and write. You have 4 million people recently enslaved. What are you going to do with them? What about their civil rights? How can you let the white South back into the Union and not give these people some kind of civil rights, even representation? Shouldn't this newly freed population be able to control its own education, its employment, representation, and even more basic, weren't they citizens? You know, so these are really serious questions. Johnson answered them. He said, it's just uncanny to me. It's scary in a way. Johnson was heard to say, this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for and by white men. So you get the horns to the dilemma right there. And go for a minute to Kennedy and say, well, there weren't really stakes here. Of course there were stakes here. But you might then want to interrupt me, and I'll interrupt myself, and you'll say, because I get this question a lot, who is this Andrew Johnson? And why was he on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln if this was his point of view? Andrew Johnson represented Tennessee in the Senate. He was in 1860, during what was called the secession crisis, just before the war and just after Lincoln was elected the first time. He was the only Southern senator who spoke out against secession, the preservation of the Union. As a result, he was hung in effigy all through the South, and when he went back to Tennessee and he left, he was chased out of Tennessee in a hail of bullets. But he was considered a hero in the North. And for his troubles, Lincoln made Johnson the military governor of the Union part of Tennessee, because Johnson really loved the Constitution, he loved the Union. And he told his fellow Southerners that slavery would be protected better within the Union than going outside of it. So his views on slavery and Black people were pretty horrible. But Lincoln didn't care about that. Lincoln in 1864 won an election, and it didn't look good for him, so he was very nervous about it. And so he thought, very much like today's terms, he really ought to balance the ticket. And what better way to balance the ticket? He had a former abolitionist on the ticket with him, a man with a great name of Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, that didn't bring anything to the ticket because it was an abolitionist from New England, and so he wanted balance. So to get balance, what better way than by getting a heroic Southerner who stood for the Union, who was, moreover, he wasn't a Republican even, which Lincoln was. He was a Democrat. And so in that particular sense, it looked like a pretty good deal. One of the things that Lincoln didn't know, of course, that we know, but of course Lincoln didn't know, is that he'd be assassinated, because he thought, well, you know, your vice president doesn't do very much. He'll just be a figurehead. He'll get me elected, and then I can prosecute the end of the war, make sure the slaves are emancipated, get a 13th Amendment, enshrining abolition into the Constitution, and proceed that particular way. Well, as we know, that wasn't what happened. And actually, the entire vice presidency of Andrew Johnson, short-lived though it was, began very badly, because he was so excited about being vice president that he said he had a cold, and he took a few too many medicinal swigs of whiskey, and he wound up planting a lobby kiss on the Bible, and so people were kind of horrified. But nonetheless, it seemed like he was going to be a very positive addition. And even when Lincoln died, it was known that Johnson had said that the South were traitors and traitors should be punished. And as soon as he got into the White House, however, since he was in his background, interesting because he was very poor. He'd grown up very poor. He'd been an indentured servant, which is one step above being a slave, because he's white, of course, and he would get his freedom at 21, but his mother farmed him out. He ran away. I mean, he really had nothing. And in the South, which is very hierarchical, he was considered white trash. So as soon as he gets to the White House, he has power over all the people who were kind of hostile to him or left him out or treated him as, having no status at all. He got in the White House and he began, as I said, pardoning these people, these Confederates, as many really as 100 a day. And then when the Congress passed civil rights legislation, civil rights bill, which is pretty, low level, all it does is restore, what it is basically give for enslaved right of due process. Johnson vetoed it. He really didn't want any part of civil rights legislation, and his hands-off policy was basically another form of states' rights or home rule that got so bad that in the South, one state after another was passing what they called black codes, which were ordinances designed to prevent freedmen and women from owning property, from traveling, from getting married, from making contracts, from basically doing anything. And in places like Louisiana, there were so many former Confederates in the state legislature that it was called a rebel legislature. And the police, again, sort of reminiscent of today, the police were organized by these white Confederates into de facto state militias. And to take one really brutal example, of this kind of police force, when there was a constitutional convention held in New Orleans to discuss the possibility, just the possibility of black voting rights, within hours of the constitutional convention being called, black men and women were executed on the streets of New Orleans point blank while they kneeled and prayed for their lives. And it was a terrible, terrible massacre. Congress, meantime, had realized, because there had been there was a Republican a majority in Congress, and it was so horrified for what happened in New Orleans and many, many other places. I'm just citing that one instance. It had already passed civil rights legislation over Johnson's veto, but it realized that wasn't enough, that it really needed the 14th Amendment, which we know really is, enshrines in the Constitution citizenship for Black people, for, due process, basically, and it gives them equal protection for all citizens, Black or white. One of the things that Johnson did that very same summer of the New Orleans massacre is that he went around the country. It's 1866. It's 1 year, right, after he's in office, just 1 year. And he goes around the country in what was called, made fun of as a swing around the circle, campaigning against the 14th Amendment. And just to stop for a second, I really have to say, the 14th Amendment is not radical. It grants people, Black or white, citizenship and therefore due process. We're not even talking about the right to vote. We're not talking about suffrage. Johnson tried to stop the 14th Amendment from being ratified by the states. He went around on this tour where as I said, the circle, he dragged along people like Ulysses S. Grant, who was so mortified by Johnson going out on the stump and screaming and yelling against the 14th Amendment and calling the people in Congress who opposed him, who passed civil rights legislation, and he calling them enemies of the people and actually calling for their execution. It was so horrific, so embarrassing, so outrageous that Grant, who was, as I said, kind of made to go with Johnson. Grant was a major hero. Grant couldn't take it. He wrote to his wife, he said, this whole thing is a national disgrace. And Grant, as you probably know, had a problem with alcohol. So he went on a bender and he got so drunk because he was so embarrassed by Johnson's shameful behavior that his friends had to lock him up in a baggage car. And he went home early. Now, I haven't even mentioned impeachment. I'm giving you the context because impeachment is a court of last resort generally. And impeachment hadn't come easily or quickly to Andrew Johnson. There were people who were trying to negotiate with him. There were a couple of outliers who called for the impeachment as early as right after 1867. But the Judiciary Committee, and we're all familiar with this now, we weren't when, I started the book, but the Judiciary Committee buried the whole thing to buy time because nobody knew, and I'm not sure people entirely still do, nobody knew what the impeachment of a president would look like or what were sufficient grounds for the impeachment. What was impeachment? Do you need, and these were all things that you've probably heard about ad nauseum last winter, is maladministration, as Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist paper. Is that enough, maladministration? Do you actually need the infraction of a law? Do you have to have a demonstrably illegal act to impeach a president? Or should a person in the presidential chair be held accountable for that person, his actions? In other words, you need a criminal offense, an actual breaking of the law, or is abuse of power, a subversion of Congress, a failure to execute the laws of the people, is that enough? And those are the questions nobody knew an answer to. And of course, nobody wanted impeachment. As I said, you just had a civil war. You just had an assassinated president. You basically haven't put the country back together. Why would you have an impeachment at this juncture? It was really, as I said, a court of last resort. So what the Congress did at this particular point is try to thwart, try to hinder Johnson's actions. And what they did is pass a series of legislation that, they hemmed him a little bit. And what they wanted to do is make sure that his white supremacist policies were tamped down, that civil rights legislation and the 14th Amendment could go forward. And it passed in that regard Reconstruction Act that consolidated the achievements of the war, freeing the slaves, by actually conferring voting rights on Black men, right? And if state legislatures in the South ratified the 14th Amendment and conferred these voting rights in new constitutions, they would be allowed back into the Union. In order to do this, in order to protect those Southern Black men and white loyalists at the polls, you needed the Secretary of War, today we call the Secretary of Defense, to protect them with the armed forces. A man named Edwin Stanton in the cabinet was Secretary of War, and he worked together with Ulysses S. Grant, who by this time is really turned off to Johnson. So Congress also passed legislation called the Tenure of Office Act. It simply said that if the Senate confirms the presidential appointee, that presidential appointee cannot be dismissed without the confirmation of the Senate. That was that. They passed that legislation. It's a weird legislation. It's been forgotten. They passed the legislation in order to protect Stanton, because Stanton was protecting the Black men at the polls in the South. Very simple in that particular way. And they figured that way we keep the peace, we keep Stanton, who is on the side of the angels, as Lincoln was, right? and everything will be fine. We don't have to go down the impeachment road. So what Johnson does, it's kind of amazing when you think about it. He violates the Tenure of Office Act. He fires Stanton. He just demands Stanton's dismissal. Stanton won't give it. Congress without a session. Then when it comes back, Congress, the Senate backs up Stanton. Johnson fires him anyway. Stanton, it's unbelievable, locks himself in his office and won't leave. And Congress at this point, the House of Representatives votes to impeach. They have the authorization to determine impeachment. The trial takes place in the Senate. They have to vote, they feel, and they vote overwhelmingly to impeach Andrew Johnson because the act broke their law. He thumbed his nose. He thumbed his nose at them. So the situation was terrible. Johnson had openly and eagerly defied Congress. He had insulted it. All right, and that was the legal pretext for the impeachment. It felt it no longer, as I said, had a choice. Now, when we go back to Kennedy for a moment, and JFK, profiles in courage, preposterous, Johnson shouldn't have been impeached, the Tenure Office Act is stupid, nobody's ever heard of it, it was later found to be constitutional. I would say this, that was just the efficient cause, because behind it, behind the passage of that law, even by those who had been previously reluctant to impeach Johnson, was the recognition that this impeachment was in fact central to the nation, to its welfare, to its future for all citizens. And Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, senator from Massachusetts, radical Republican, loathed Johnson, stood up very firmly for abolition and then for the impeachment of Johnson and for the enfranchisement of Black men and for civil rights legislation. He said, and I think this is what's so interesting about the impeachment, he said, Charles Sumner said, that this, meaning impeachment, is one of the last great battles with slavery, that it's about fairness and equality and a redefinition of the country. Frederick Douglass, same thing. The impeachment of the president, I'm quoting Douglass now, said will be a hopeful indication the triumph of our right to vote. It'll mean that the fair South shall no longer be governed by the Ku Klux Klan, but by impartial law. Right? And that's what impeachment meant at that time, a hopeful indication of a different opportunity, a different way that America could go. So in order to sort of begin to sum up, I would say, look, impeachment is complicated even to this day. One of the things that it implies is failure at the very top. But it also, I would suggest, and I have suggested, that it's certainly in the 19th century, and maybe now, that it also implied hope. It was the kind of hope of a better time coming, a fairer, a more just country. It was the hope and the promise that an American president couldn't act like a king, but that we had a country of checks and balances that can maintain itself courageously, even after a war, without waging a new one. So, by way of conclusion, I would say simply, all of this is a way of saying simply, what was this? I told you what happened. So why don't we know about it? Why does it seem to have disappeared? Preposterous tenure of office. Nobody knows about that. Nobody cares. I think the reason is, and I said this a long time ago, it now seems sort of prescient again. Maybe my friend who called me a witch is right, but I really think that the reason is that the impeachment of Andrew Johnson was about race, and that's why we didn't know about it. It was another attempt, according to the Impeachers, whom I believe, it was another attempt to preserve the Union and free the slaves, not just because, or not, certainly they were free, but what they wanted to do is eradicate the noxious and lingering effects of slavery, of an appalling institution that treated people like property. And so that was the reason behind impeachment. That was the reason that the impeachers took the act that they did. It was fundamental to the nation. It does, to my mind, explain, as I said, why we know so little about it, because the nation changed in a certain sense from what we got in 1865 to 1868, then to the end of the century and early 20th century with the resurrection of the Confederacy, the Lost Cause, the South, the Leaguer. Well, in that context, impeachment was buried. Andrew Johnson was kind of forgotten, and we turned our back. But I think it's really important, and it's obviously really important to me. So thanks for your patience, and I look forward to hearing your questions, although I guess I go to a chat thing and find them out, or Mark can help me with that.
Yeah, that's what got me for.
Oh, good. I don't have to do anything more then. I can try to answer them or not. But.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. That was all. I mean, I'd never heard about his little tour de force about going against the 14th Amendment.
What a guy.
Yeah. Question for you. We've obviously, I think everybody in the audience has, in their textbooks, we always heard about the radical Republicans, and you know, it certainly came in for a different slant. As I learned later in life, the textbook was printed in Texas. It probably did come from a certain slant. Why was this poor, white trash, as you said, why was he so willing to forgive a class that had been so tough on him? Why was he so quick to forgive?
Well, it's a great question. It's a wonderful question. I can answer it. Ultimately, I don't know his psychology entirely, but I can answer it by giving you an example of something that Andrew Johnson did. Andrew Johnson, as I mentioned, as you just mentioned too, came from absolutely nothing, less than nothing, such poverty. When he settled in Tennessee, and since he had been apprenticed as a tailor, he knew something about, making clothes. He made clothes very well. He did very well. His tailor shop was well thought of. He expanded. He hired more people. He began to acquire real estate, and he began to run for local office and then state office. As his finances grew and he became fairly comfortable, if not well-to-do, one of the things that he does, one of the first things that he does to show that he's arrived, is he buys human beings. He purchases slaves, which to me tells you a lot about his character. There's a man named Thaddeus Stevens, one of the impeachers, radical Republican from Vermont originally, representative of Pennsylvania, also from abject poverty. In his case, in the case of Stevens, what poverty did for him was make him more empathetic to people who were similarly impoverished, who had very little. So it made him sensitive to the conditions of people who just haven't been able to get a fair shake. Johnson was not of that type. When he began to rise in the world, he also began to feel powerful and want to be a participant and in control of the people who had excluded him. Now he's one of them, see? So in some sense, it's a way of exercising power that he has over them, but also being really, in some sense, they become in his debt. So I think that it's a very subtle kind of thing that happens that his background, I think, speaks to him in a, you know, in an interesting way. And if he weren't so horrible, in an almost poignant way.
You mentioned about the radical Republicans, and that's always how there always references that. Looking back on them now, as you're doing your research, and this is the group that's opposed to Johnson, was the moniker apt? You know, was calling them the radical Republicans a fair summarization, or is that
Well,
paint them in a bad light?
Well, like you, and I grew up in Massachusetts, so, but like you, I heard the radical Republicans, they were basically, you know, fanatics, and, you know, they were in league with the devil, and radical was meant to, you know, sort of be scary. A way of understanding that is progressive. I mean, they were also called Black Republicans, meaning that they were too sympathetic with Black people. Lincoln was called a Black Republican. These were epithets that were put on them, particularly afterwards, when they didn't mind being called radical Republicans. Now it would be as if somebody's called a progressive. Nobody minds being called a progressive, although being called a radical still has a kind of negative connotation to it. So they were progressive. I was always taught that, oh, they just wanted power. Well, yeah, of course they wanted power. They wanted power to enfranchise people. You know, everybody in Congress wants power. So it's still a name that sticks. But I think the resonance has changed. If we just understand it's progressive, or that, you know, when we're saying radical Republicans, we really don't mean people who want to destroy things. What they want to do is build back the country better. So.
If you got a question, type it in the chat thing. We got some questions coming in here. It said, Johnson was a racist and terrible president. Didn't the Supreme Court rule in Myers versus United States in 1926 that the Tenure of Office Act was likely invalid?
Yeah.
And then, do you believe that it's appropriate to convict someone using an invalid law?
Well, it was later. Well, sure, if it had been invalid at the time of the impeachment, but the time of the impeachment, it wasn't invalid. In other words, you know, let's say you're pinched for driving, you know, 90 miles an hour, and the speed limit is 60, you know, but then, you know, in a year, it becomes 90 miles an hour. It still doesn't invalidate the fact that you broke the law when you drove too fast. So it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, as I said, it's a dubious law. It's a weird law. And nobody's going to go to the barricades to defend it. And it was found to be unconstitutional. Your question is absolutely right. But it wasn't invalid at the time.
Okay. By the end of the war, the industrialists and profiteers of the North were an organized bloc, as they continue to this day. What position did that bloc take on the impeachment?
Well, it wasn't as organized as you think at this particular time, because the country was in disarray, and it was, and the Republicans themselves were divided. There were radicals, as Mark just mentioned. There were moderates, and there were conservatives, and they represented different aspects of what you know, your question is calling the industrial bloc. It's a little bit more complicated because there were different views of the tariff, there were different views of monetary policy. One of the interesting things about Andrew Johnson was that he had the ability to unite these different parts of the Republican Party that would later, during the Grant administration, spin out of control. So they were actually united, and the issues had less to do with industrialization per se than getting rid of Johnson and then making the country fairer so that the South could actually enjoy the fruits of industry. Now, remember, the South was blasted, the railroads were gone. I mean, it basically had nothing. So it's complicated at that particular time. But the simplest thing is to say Andrew Johnson's policies were so egregious and his point of view so awful that he united all the different parts of the Republican Party at that time.
that kind of segues into the next question. Absent Johnson's violation of the Tenure of Office Act and his subsequent impeachment, do you think President Johnson would still have such a poor reputation among presidential scholars?
I'm sorry, read the first part again. I'm sorry.
Well,
After?
Absent Johnson's violation of the Tenure of Office Act and his subsequent impeachment, do you think President Johnson would still have such a poor reputation among presidential scholars?
Yeah, I think so, in the sense that, as I said, impeachment was a court of last resort. He'd already, you know, he already alienated not just people in his own party, the Republicans, but don't forget that he alienated the people in, I mean, I'm sorry, alienated people in the Republican Party, but he also alienated the Democrats, who theoretically were his party. And what was interesting then is that 1868 was an election year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Neither Republicans nor Democrats put him on the ballot. I mean, Republicans certainly weren't going to, but his own party, and he couldn't understand it. I mean, he was a man without a lot of insight. He couldn't understand it. He thought, well, look all the good things that I've done, you know, how come you're not nominating me? He was very, very hurt. So, yeah, I think so. He didn't really bring anything to the presidency except enormous division, animosity, fear, and disarray. I think he would be remembered with or without the impeachment in that particular way.
Two questions in one here. Was it that little jaunt against the 14th Amendment?
Yeah.
Is that ultimately what propelled Grant to run to accept the nomination for presidency in 1868?
It's my view. It's my view, and I'm not sure Ron Chernow, who's a friend of mine, would totally agree, although he might have changed his mind. It's my view that Grant was already early on eyeing the presidency, but Grant was a man who played his cards very close to his chest. He was, I think he had to have known, because he had enough what we call today handlers who are already eyeing the president, you know, the presidency in 1868. The Republicans wanted somebody like Grant who was going to keep the party together. But I think what happened was the swing around the circle certainly didn't endear Johnson to Grant, but even more when Grant was embroiled by Johnson in the Tenure of Office Act, the firing of Stanton, because what I didn't tell you about is that what Johnson wanted to do is replace Stanton with Grant and put Grant sort of in the middle, and then undermine Grant by making it seem like Grant and Johnson were on the same page. Grant was so furious at that point that he started writing these letters and printing them, having them printed in the newspapers against Johnson. So, you know, Grant had been on a slow boil, really, or simmer, from the time of the swing around the circle. He didn't much like Johnson, but Johnson really brought it to a boil with the firing of Stanton and the news trying to use Grant. So, but Grant had his, Grant had his eyes on the presidency, I'm sure of it.
How did Andrew Johnson's wife react to the impeachment?
Well, it's hard to know. She's one of these first ladies about whom we know very little, and it's hard to know why we know so little. Was it because she kind of heard about perhaps some of his philandering back in Nashville? She was said to be an invalid, although she outlived him and a lot of other people. She was very quiet in the White House. She very rarely was seen. But I think she was I shouldn't say obviously, but I think that she was pleased that he was not convicted. You know, it's humiliating to be impeached. Conviction is something else again. But, you know, once impeached, always impeached. We remember that Johnson was impeached, not that he was acquitted. I mean, and that is really a kind of stain, and I think that's what will happen in the future. it's really an awful thing. So I'm sure she was distressed and relieved, and she was probably very relieved when the family, left the White House and went back to Tennessee. But to be fair, I should say that eventually, in the 1870s, Tennessee sent Andrew Johnson back to the Senate. And as soon as he got there were flowers on his desk. And one of his first things that he did was stand up and make a kind of rant against Ulysses S. Grant. We don't know much about his, Senate career after impeachment because he died, while on vacation or something. But in any event, he did come back. Let that be a lesson.
Well, one last question, and speaking
Sure.
of acquittal, what becomes of Senator Ross of Kansas? What becomes of him?
Ross does pretty well for a while because he keeps going back to Johnson and saying, I want this job and I want that job and I want this and that. And then he wrote a very self-justifying, kind of self-pitying memoir. He went off to Mexico. New Mexico rather. It was alleged fraud against him. He wrote a self-justifying memoir that I think Ted Sorensen used as the research for Profiles of Courage. So he kind of disappeared. He wasn't well thought of in the Senate when he was there. He was a junior senator. And then he made a career really out of his courageous, and I'm being very facetious, act, but not a noteworthy one.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight.
My
I want to
pleasure.
thank everyone for joining us. Again, the book is called The Impeachers. It is at 8 Cousins. Brenda, thank you very much for even if it was from a distance. I'm glad you were able to come to Falmouth even remotely. And,
I'll be there in person someday soon, I hope. And thank you, Mark, for putting this all together, for inviting me back, even though it didn't work out. And we'll all move forward into better weather
there we go.
All right. Metaphorically and all other ways. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Okay.
We'll see you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye, Mark. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.